In some of my previous videos, I've talked about how underloading can increase the risk of injury in our athletes. I've talked about how returning to sport doesn't necessarily mean returning to peak performance. So, in this next video, I'm going to talk about how the different players within each of the team, the strength and conditioning, the sports medicine, the sports coaches, and the athlete themselves, and how they can all play a role in keeping the athlete injury free and performing at a really high level. When an athlete sustains an injury, a lot of people start questioning who was to blame. Was it the strength and conditioning coaches who trained the athlete too hard? Or was it the sports medicine team who didn't screen the athlete well enough? We've discussed some of these questions and a few other challenges relating to training load in one of our recent papers relating to the training load paradox and whether sports medicine and high performance staff can work together as teammates. And in this paper, we described how strength and conditioning staff and sports medicine team can contribute to both performance and keeping the athlete injury free. Now, it's important to think about the kind of challenges that the different staff within a team have. If you're part of a strength and conditioning team, if you're a strength and conditioning coach, your focus is getting that athlete as fit as possible, as quickly as possible. Now, when you have this type of approach, when you use this type of approach, what it can commonly lead to is an inappropriate increase in training loads. And what we know is when we ramp up training loads really quickly, it increases the risk of injury. When you get injured, you get exposed to low loads, and low loads are also associated with injury. So we end up with players in a little bit of a feedback loop. I call them the chronic rehabber, where low loads increases the risk of injury, which increases the risk of subsequent injury. And your athlete ends up in this chronic rehab cycle. The only way out of there is they get exposed to low loads, which leads to poor fitness and poor performance. So it's not an ideal situation. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, though, we have the sports medicine team. Now, if you're a sports medicine staff member and you believe that high training loads cause overuse injury, then what's the best way to reduce overuse injuries? Just reduce all training loads. But when you think like this, when you think I have to protect that athlete from overuse injury by reducing all training loads, we know that low training loads increase the risk of injury, which increases the risk of subsequent injuries. So now we're back in the chronic rehab loop, where low loads lead to poor fitness and poor performance. Now, I've always looked at the training load and performance relationship and the training load injury relationship in terms of the strength and conditioning team's involvement and the sports medicine team's involvement. But there's also a third player in the mix here, and that's the coaching team. Now, if you're an assistant coach or a head coach, your mindset is, I need to win tomorrow, or I need to win on the weekend. And in order to do that, I need to get as many reps into my players as possible. I need to practice the skill and rehearse those skills as much as possible so they can perform them on game day. Now, when you think like that, there's no consideration of load. And when you don't consider load at all, it increases the risk of overuse injury, where you end up back in the chronic rehab loop. Now, coaches don't need to be experts in training load, but they do need to be experts in performance. And I can guarantee you, if they don't understand training load, they understand performance. And they understand that low training loads leads to poor fitness and poor performance. So now we have three players in the mix. We have the strength and conditioning staff, we have the sports medicine team, and we have the coaches themselves. But when an athlete breaks down on day one of preseason, typically the finger gets pointed in one or a couple of directions. It gets pointed at the strength and conditioning coach for training them too hard, or it gets pointed at the medical team. They didn't screen them well enough, or it gets pointed at the coaches. They kept them out on the field too long and practiced for too long. But no one ever says to the player, what have you done in your off season to prepare you for preseason training? And this is where the athlete comes in. And this is our fourth player in the mix. Now, I'm not saying all athletes think like this, but some do. And some athletes have a mindset of, I'll do just enough to do my job. And when we have a mindset like that, it leads to corner cutting. And if you cut corners often enough, if you miss a rep, it turns into missing a set, which turns into missing a session, which turns into missing a week, and the next minute you know you've missed a month of training. You've cut corners so far that you've resulted in low chronic training loads. And low loads means that you've increased the risk of injury. You put yourself back in that chronic rehab cycle where low loads lead to poor fitness and poor performance. So there's four players in the mix that can contribute to keeping the athlete injury-free and ensuring that they're performing at a really high level. Now, when we focus on all these different challenges, all these different reasons for our job and the different things that drive why we do our job, it can sometimes confuse why we're actually involved in sport. And if I gave you one question, I threw one question at you and asked you, what is the one reason that you do the job that you're in, or the one reason why you're involved in sport? The answer is we want to get good performance. And our performance can mean different things for different people. It can mean different things for a professional athlete or a junior athlete, or performance can mean something different for our older populations, our older athletes that we work with. But no matter which way we look at it, if we want to get our athletes to good performance, we need to be fit to do that. And in order to be fit, we need to systematically and progressively build our athletes to higher training loads. There's no easy way to get there. But when we can build our athletes to higher training loads, it builds physical fitness, but it also builds a kind of mental toughness. You're strong upstairs and physically you're robust as well. And when you have that situation, you give yourself and your athletes the best chance of achieving great performances. So the last point I'll leave you with is this. How would you train if you weren't governed by fear of injury? How would you train if your only focus was on good performance? And when we think of it in those terms, the answer is really simple. We will build to high training loads because higher training loads gives us physical and mental robustness, which gives us the best chance of good performance. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video. If you did, feel free to leave a comment or visit us at gabbetperformance.com to see how we can help your team.